Our first presenter is John Bennett. He is the past director and former chair of the Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association. Welcome, Mr. Bennett.
Okay, I'm kind of calling this Carbon Credit 101. A lot of it's kind of history, and I'll kind of end where I think we're at now. You can see the agenda, you can read it. Those are the points we're going to cover. I won't read that slide for you. Okay. Hitting the button here, and I'm not hitting that thing. Okay, one thing you got to know is this is really a Saskatchewan issue. These two charts come out of from the National Inventory folks. We were in Ottawa this winter, and the important thing of this, these two charts, is the red bars are the emissions, the nitrous emissions that come from our fertilizer use. The blue stuff below the line is the sequestration, and the black line is the net. So in terms of politics, this gives us a little bit of issues, because in Canada, soil or agriculture is a net emitter. In Saskatchewan, a very unique jurisdiction, we're a net sink. So we do a pretty good job of this, and it goes back a long time why we have this. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of SSCA's history in this thing. I got to put my spectacles on here. Okay, SSCA has had a long history in this. I'm sure most of you who've been in the province know that SSA was a very powerful force in transforming agriculture into basically what we see today. 30 years ago, zero-till was unheard of, and now it's the common practice. And to have that amount of change in that amount of time is quite dramatic. Our first involvement with greenhouse gases is we put a recommendation forward to the federal government in 1990, recommending that they include soil sinks in the negotiations in Kyoto. And we put together the best information we had. We came up with a very conservative estimation of what sequestration would be. We've always run conservative numbers, because one of the things you have to understand is we have very limited resources. The horsepower we bring behind this is not real strong, and the last thing you want to do is get involved in a debate on the numbers you're putting forward. So we've always come up with conservative numbers so that the debate doesn't get away from the issue into the numbers. We got involved with offset discussions. What happened is we had utility companies coming to us in Saskatchewan looking to buy carbon offsets. To be frank, we didn't really understand the issue very well, but the first thing we did is we got all the soil conservation organizations we knew together to say, look, we better figure this out before any of us do a deal, because whoever does the first deal is going to set the rules for there on in. We got together, at that time there was more conservation groups across Canada. We got the ones in the US, the Pacific Northwest Direct Seed Association, Manitoba, North Dakota, which was MANDAC. And the agreement we made with them is, let's nobody sign a carbon deal until we've all read it and we all understand it. So as a result of that, we actually did the very first carbon trade in North America, which was between Pacific Northwest Direct Seed Association. I'll talk a little bit more about it. We then did the first carbon trade in Canada. It was called Pearl, and it was an initiative that was done a long time ago. I can't remember which Liberal Premier was in charge. It was called Pearl, Pilot Emission Reduction and Learning. It was $1 million trade, largely to try and figure out how to do it. That's formed a bit of the template for what's happening in Alberta right now. Then we have, of course, the current lobby. We're doing the best we can with limited resources to influence most the feds and the province. So I keep doing the wrong thing here. Okay, the politics are quite interesting. The most recent thing is the Paris Accord. The Vancouver Declaration is Canadian. It reinforces the Paris Accord. What's important to us in the Paris Accord, it's a long, long document, but it was signed by every country in the world. I think there were 2 exceptions. Kazakhstan was one, another small country was another. The politics have changed a little bit because I think everybody who signed it ratified it with the exception of the US. The Vancouver Declaration is basically the feds in the province, and they agreed to support the Paris Accord. There's no arguing between the provincial governments and the federal governments as to the urgency of actually addressing climate change, which is quite nice if you want to read Saskatchewan's official positions in the white paper, all of which recognize soils as quite important. Trump I really don't like talking about Trump. His grasp of economics is hopeless. His grasp of environment is equally as hopeless. He has a very strong coal lobby behind him, and he's setting up an advisory committee to advise him on climate change issues. No matter where you come in this, there is always contrarian science, which means there's a general agreement in the science community, but you'll always find a contrarian who'll say that's nonsense. I will warn you up front, when it comes to questions, I am not going to comment on whether global warming is real or not. I'll either refer you to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences report that they sent to George Bush when he asked how accurate the science was, or I'll refer you to the Earth is Flat Society. I have no time for that anymore. Okay, Alberta and federal elections are coming up. This could influence. The more important thing is COP24. This was alluded to in one of the earlier conversations. COP24 is past tense. It happened, I think, it was in Oslo or Helsinki or someplace. It was supposed to be the forum, the international forum that was going to set the rules for international offset trading. It's a very, very complex and difficult subject. And quite frankly, I think they just sort of ran out of energy on it. So it's been deferred. So we don't have any real rules on offset markets. I will throw this out. Offset markets and carbon offsets brings out all the charlatans and knaves in the world. There's some bad stuff has happened there. Okay, these are the basic challenges. This is a little bit of review for some people, but I've got this term called new tons. Is a ton of carbon sequestered in 2020? A new ton of carbon sequestered? Is a ton sequestered this year? A new ton suggested. So there's 2 things that crop up in this conversation all the time. I'm just kind of jumping across here, but the first is baseline. And what baseline refers to is what instituted the change, or what prompted the change. Because officially, the notion is that if something's a common practice, it's not new, and therefore it doesn't qualify for any offsets. Which would mean basically anybody who's zero-tilled in this country for before last year wouldn't be eligible for offset, any offset credits on it. We've argued against that. We point to a contract that SSDA did in 1990, earlier than that, it was in late 80s, where we signed a contract with TransAlta Utilities to promote zero-till, and we sort of say, well, that can be the factor that changed farming. But it's a difficult issue. Now the second one is even more complicated, and it's called additionality. Now what additionality means is, and we all know that our farming systems are constantly evolving. You know, we bring something into it, and then later on we bring something else into it, and then later on we bring something else to it. So what I'll do is I'll just run a series of things that sort of profiles my zero-till experience, and I'm sure you'd be able to relate to this. The first thing is we bought the machines and we had a go at the zero-till. Then what we brought into it is we realized we're not going to continuous crop zero-till wheat and canola. So we started to pull things like pulses into our rotations. And then we started to pull other things into our rotations. And then we started to modify our fertilizing practices. So all of those contribute to biomass generation, which is how you get carbon sequestration, but they're additional. So if you have a baseline, do you sort of say the baseline doesn't include zero-till, but does include pulses? So you can see it gets rather complicated. So it's pretty easy to defeat. Now the competing interest thing here is very, very important, because what you need to understand is the bulk of greenhouse gas policy has been aimed towards the emitters. And the emitter side of this equation, they don't want a baseline way back when. They want a baseline as close to the present as they can be, because the target that they have for reduction is from the baseline to where they're at now. So if you go back to 1990, which was the original baseline, and the emissions here, you got this. But if you move the baseline up this way, oops, sorry, didn't mean to bang that, you get closer and closer and there's less target, correct? So a lot of these rules on baseline and additionality were designed to aid the emitter side of the equation, and have been detrimental to us on the plus side of the equation. Now the other thing here I've got is competing interests. So this is a natural sort of offshoot from the additionality and the baseline. In carbon markets, you've got two forces at work. You want emitters that want cheap offsets, full stop, end of story, and you have other interests. Environmentalists, for example, aren't that fussy about this notion. They sort of view offsets as indulgences that the emitter sides can do, and they want basically reduction at source. That's kind of where they're at. So it's difficult for us as a sector to kind of stick handle through all these challenges, particularly, as I say, when we have minimal resources. Okay, so I'm going to sort of talk about the history of trading offsets. The top line here are global initiatives. There have been a multitude of offset markets. Most have failed. I'll try and explain why some of the failures are. There was a London offset, carbon offset market. I actually went to the offices about 10 years ago. There was a European one, I think it was in Frankfurt. Now I put China with a question mark here, because China has been quite supportive of offsets. I mean, they're a massive emitter. Offsets are very useful to them. But in the current climate, they were actually quite happy with Trump's contrarian views of global warming, because it would mean that the US, who might be the logical source or place of an offset market, would by default not be some. But the current confusion, which we all are aware of, means that I'm not sure how favorable folks would be, well, I mean, in this room, to China for why would we grant them the offset market potential? But that's another thing. So North American initiatives. The very first trade was done by the PNWDSA, which is the Pacific Northwest Direct Seed Association, and a utility company in Texas called Entergy, and it was a lease. The interesting thing about that, it was the very first trade, and Environmental Defense was the broker. And Environmental Defense is a very, very interesting environmental organization. They're basically businessmen who think that, the global warming is a serious issue, but we have to approach it from a business perspective. We just can't sort of regulate things into into compliance. So as a result of that, they're often pillared by the real staunch environmentalist folks who, and also sometimes they're pillared by the energy sector because, they don't fit either camp. Okay, so the next interesting thing was the Chicago Climate Exchange. There was a climate change set up in Chicago. It had nothing to do with Chicago Mercantile. The reason that Chicago was in the title was everybody who's ever traded grains or sold grains knows that Chicago Mercantile is the big deal. By association, they were hoping if they had Chicago in their name, it would give them some credibility. That did get to Saskatchewan. Sea Green came and was recruiting and signing up farmers. And it basically, Chicago Climate failed. I'll give you a little bit of history on Chicago Climate because it's quite interesting. But the reason that London, the European one, and the Chicago Climate Exchange failed is they did not have regulatory approval, which means the governments wouldn't accept an offset that was created. And if you're an emitter, why are you going to buy an offset that has no value? Now, I'm going to burp or cough, one of the two. Maybe I should have a drink of water. Chicago Climate Exchange was a very, very interesting thing. It had a lot of horsepower behind it. It was created by a fellow called Richard Sandor, who's most famous for derivatives. And if any of you follow markets and the word derivatives pops in front of you, you should quake with fear. He basically got a bunch of big emitters in a room. I was there. It was quite interesting. And this is at the time when the emitters' official response to climate change was what they called the Greening of America Society. And they hired about 1,500 contrarian scientists to claim that increased CO2 was a wonderful, wonderful thing for the planet, the US in particular. And that was what they were pushing back with. But one thing about real serious businessmen is they may say one thing, but their success or failure is predicated on how accurately they read the future. And I still remember his comment, you guys can be all the emitters, okay? And I'm standing up in front of you, and your official position is this is all nonsense. You've hired people to do that, and if you're asked, that's what you say. And Richard Sandor's address says, now you guys all know that we're going to run into a carbon-constrained future, which means this is not nonsense. And there were lots of nodding in the crowd. And he said, well, the way to address this, and you all will know, if you're responsible executives, you will have done the math to know what it's going to cost your company. And there's lots of nodding going on. They said, well, I have a solution for you. And the solution is we create a climate exchange, you buy carbon offsets, and when the regulator comes calling, you bring out your offsets to send them back to his corner. And I happen to be sitting next to the USDA guy, the US Department of Environment. I was invited to some prestigious thing. And I said, well, how are you guys going to deal with this? What are you going to do when all these guys in the room come to you with a mitt full of cards saying I bought offsets? He says, we're not going to allow any of it. He said, why would we take on the job of sifting through a gazillion carbon credits that may or may not have any value? He said, the easiest thing is just to not do it. So you can actually track the value of Chicago Climate Exchange. The carbon credits ran up to about $30 there for a while, and they wobbled up and down. But I last looked at the market, maybe 5 years ago, and it was about zero, and I think it's just gone away, to be honest with you. Now, the one thing, all you guys who signed CGRE contracts, you're lucky that they went away, because that contract you signed actually obligated you to some stuff you didn't really understand. So there was a lot of liability associated with those contracts. But since it's gone away, it's gone away. Okay, Pearl. This was the federal one that SSCA brokered between the federal government and Canadian farmers. We put it together, it was $1 million deal, and it was a lease. So we didn't actually sell offsets, we just rented the storage space for a while, so we leased it out. So consider it as interest on the principal. The lease concept was not too popular with the emitters because if you remember my comments earlier on competing interests, emitters want cheap offsets, full stop, end of story. Okay, so now we have the Alberta system. The reason that the Alberta system is very interesting is they've addressed a few issues. The major one is they got regulatory agreements. So the government of Alberta agreed that if you, as an emitter, bought an offset on the Alberta carbon market, it would exempt you from the penalty side of the equation. It's a mysterious system. It said on the Alberta Ag website that there was $170 million exchanged hands for 13 million metric tons that was shared between aggregators and farmers. You do the math on that, that's $13.07 a metric ton, which is understandable because the penalty was $15. So if you're faced between, you're not going to pay more than $15 for an offset. Now, the risk for us in this, and this became evident to me when I was talking to the federal lady who was in charge of setting up Canada's emission trading system. She came out of the Alberta system, is to develop a carbon market as an offset, and the rules for it is a very, very complicated business. And there's not a lot of departmental officials that are really prepared to jump in and try and sift through it and make something that will work. So if somebody has a system that's there, we use the term cut and paste. Why not just take what somebody's done and use it? Now, here's why it would give us some problem. Is the 170 million metric tons, remember it's split between aggregators and farmers, and there's no transparency in that system. Oops, sorry, I need to go back. How do I go back? I guess I can do this. Okay, here's a farmer contract. I've stroked out the guy's name and his quarter numbers, but each of those dates, there's a quarter for each of those dates. So this particular farmer got, I expect it's $3,400. I think there's something wrong with this picture. $170 million, and this grower got $3,400. Now, I have to be fair to the supporters of the Alberta system. There could be nitrous emissions in here. There were multiple years of this thing in here, but we all know from markets, let's just say wheat. Okay, there is a price discovery mechanism, isn't there? I mean, anybody in this room in 3 minutes can tell you what the price of wheat is. You know, there's a price discovery mechanism. And then there's basis. I mean, you can figure out your basis if you talk to 3 different line companies, and that's the cost of the transaction. So there's openness. The other fundamental thing you have to have in a market is you have to be able to hold it. If you don't like the price of wheat, you can put it in your bin, close the doors. In the Alberta system, the challenge I see, and now they've done this for a reason, and this gets really complicated, so you guys are going to really have to focus on this. The lady I talked to in Ottawa, when we gave her our numbers for sequestration in Saskatchewan, said, if you dump those number of credits on the market, the price will go to zero. You know, the supply of offsets will far outstrip the demand. And if you look at London, Frankfurt, and Chicago, there's a truth to that. So in the design of the Alberta system, as a farmer, you never own an offset. what you do is you sign the rights to create an offset to your aggregator. Okay, and that controls the supply, because the aggregator is not going to create a bunch of offsets that there's no market for. And now I've struggled to figure out how we relate to that in our world, and this is the way I've done it. Look at the pork industry. In essence, the demand side of that is controlled by the end user, isn't it? And the way that system has functioned is it basically deconstructed the pork industry, hasn't it? There was no value in growers for this, or producers. So they fell off the planet, fell off the planet, fell off the planet, and now there's none. Now, with offsets, if you use that mechanism, what it'll mean, and I'll just, is you guys, I'm your aggregator, I'll sell your offsets. Sorry, you guys are out of luck, you're out of luck, you're out of luck, because there's only a market for this. But what it really means is, if you decide you want too much for your offsets, maybe I'll buy them from you, right? Or if you want too much, I'll go to you. So where is your price discovery mechanism here? The price discovery mechanism only works if there's a balance of power between the supplier and the end user. And in the Alberta system, in my view, that's completely wrong. I had a smart guy, one guy I worked with who's way smarter than me. He looked at both the previous one, you know, the 170 million, he looked at this, the wheels turned his head for about 30 seconds. He says, this is an 85% basis. So anyway, it's a system that functions, and it can have the ear of government, and particularly the departmental system, because cut and paste, we just take it and plunk it in here. The question that we should be putting forward as growers is, will this market serve us? Will it bring value to the farm gate? And it's important that we get full value for this back to the farm gate, because the costs are coming our way regardless, aren't they? So what we're kind of hoping here is that an offset system will balance some of the costs that are added into our system. Now, we've chosen deliberately to not get in on either side of the debate between carbon tax versus carbon market. I suspect that the balance will be somewhere in between. But whether we have a carbon tax in Saskatchewan or not, there's still going to be costs to the system coming to your farm. You know, your new tractors, it's not going to come out of Saskatchewan. You know, all your inputs that do not come out of Saskatchewan are going to have a carbon tax embedded in them. So it'll reduce the costs to the farm gate, but it won't eliminate them. Now, our sense is what we really need to do is we need to build a credible alternative to what is coming out of Alberta. We can use the Pearl thing, I think, as the basis. This was scrutinized and vetted very vigorously at the federal level, so I think it would be the template. I think one of the crucial things is we've got to have farmer ownership of the offsets. So you gotta own the things. We got to have transparency and price discovery and basis discovery. I think, and I'll go back to the Paris Accord and the Vancouver Declaration. The Paris Accord is absolutely clear that the goal of all good global citizens is to maintain the sinks you've got and increase the sinks you've got. So there's two value streams, maintenance, and we shouldn't forget that in agriculture, and creation of offsets. In Saskatchewan at this point, particularly, and I hate to give you a quiz on Carbon 101 early slide, additionality and baseline, if those come into play, the only thing we've got left is the maintenance side of the equation. Okay, so that's why I have this little point here, leasing and sales opportunity for maintenance and creation. There's some very, very interesting things in the Alberta system. There's three big aggregators that probably did 95% of the business. They are acting as guarantor of the offset but for only 8 years. And I can't quite figure out how you translate an 8-year contract into an emission. You know, like if you're going to be the emitter, you're going to buy an 8-year indulgence. What do you do after that? Do you have to go find somebody else to supply you the next 8 years? And they also act as the verifier. Now, the thing that we absolutely must do, and I think Saskatchewan will either get it right here or it'll escape us completely. And the reason I say that, if you go back to the second slide I showed you with the graphs and charts, this shows that Saskatchewan is the real player in this. So we have to get it. We have to get it right. It has to have integrity, because if it doesn't have absolute integrity, it'll just completely come apart. Because as I said in one of my earlier comments, the charlatans and knaves are out of this one. There'll be more smoke and mirrors and stuff, and so we've got to get it right, and we've got to have really good science. The one thing that is important, if we have a system in Saskatchewan, is the provincial government is going to have to play a role. The Alberta government played the role as the registrar of the offsets and monitored their moving back and forth. So quite a complicated thing. Here's the challenge. Sometimes I'm dismayed. If not us, then who? You know, if you're going to let somebody else do it for you, you're not going to get what you want. The reason we have been as successful as we have at SSCA, and I think it's very, very important in agriculture, is you can influence things when they're being designed. After the fact, if you're trying to deconstruct something bad, the amount of energy taken, it just defeats you. So you either be proactive and try and make it right, or you'll forever after be fighting a rearguard action to improve it and make it work for you. Okay. So then, conclusions and questions. Again, if you ask whether global warming is real, or you're going to offer me some suggestion that your ice was 8 foot thick this year, and so it's all fictitious, please don't ask those questions, because I'll be rude. Okay.
Do you want me to hang up for questions, or just? Yeah. Do you have any questions for Mr. Bennett? If you have any questions, please come to the mic again. If not, I believe.
I was hoping I hadn't scared the hell out of you.
I'm just really curious as to whether you feel that our provincial government has any stomach for going into this, because we kind of pursued this 10 years ago, and it was like, forget what Alberta did, we're sure not going down that road. And so I'm really curious kind of your take on acceptability within our government to address it.
Okay, I didn't discover or comment on this at all earlier, but quite a while ago, in the early Sask Party years, there was an offset working group that was created. It had representative from emitters. We were there as behalf of farmers. SARM was there, and they were keen on it. But where they got really crusty is if it became part of the Alberta system, Saskatchewan offsets could leave and go to Alberta, and I think they didn't care for that. It basically, most of these things, they either make progress or they just sort of fade away. They never stop. There's no, this is over, here's the report, we're done. It just, meetings got rarer and eventually non-existent. Now, if you read the Saskatchewan white paper, now I'll run these numbers by you. Saskatchewan's plus side of the equation for greenhouse gases is carbon capture and storage at Shand. Costs $1 billion. Removes about 1 million metric tons annually. And in their numbers, soil carbon sequestration, I'd have to go look the numbers, so don't quote it, but close to 10 million metric tons. So soil sinks are the biggest tool in their arsenal, if you want to believe it. But I'm not sure. It's a hard question. A satisfactory answer?
It's a hard one.
Sir?
Back 1 to 9. I wonder, John, how much influence does the US administration have on the whole scheme? In about, I would say, after 2010, there was a big discussion going on about carbon offsets, especially the industry here. And there was a conference right here in Saskatoon at the time, industry. I was representing Sask Flax on there, and they had one of the key speaker was a trade lawyer out of Washington DC. He was flown in specifically for that. He gave a presentation, and after that he left. No discussion. Anyways, what he alluded to, he was basically saying the carbon sequestration only the topic goes about industry, manufacturing, etc. Exclude agriculture. We don't want in the States to do anything with agriculture. Maybe because there are so many subsidies already on the US farmer, that would be an additional one. And so basically the topic was off the table for agriculture at all. Does that have influence in our situation today?
America obviously has huge influence. I mean, our canola situation is derived by America, is it not? Now, what happens in America is their politics are, quite frankly, really screwed up. Because what used to happen in America is if you were a Republican, you courted the right wing, and as soon as you had your support, you ran to the middle. Or if you were a Democrat, you courted the left-wing liberals, and as soon as you had their support, you ran to the middle. Because once you started running to the middle, they didn't have any option. And now what's happened is the far spectrums kind of control it. But I'll give you an antidote. Maybe I don't know, it's not the right term. We pulled way above our weight on this file, and we were invited to Washington D.C. and I spoke to people from the White House and from the Senate, and even spoke to their national negotiator. But it was fascinating at that time because if you remember American politics, Bill Clinton's future as a president was a bit in doubt because of a lady called Monica Lewinsky. And what I saw actually happen there is the folks that were championing the climate change thing, they were waiting to see whether he would survive before they moved their ideas into the political world. Because in that world, if you champion something that fails, you fail. So one of the pivotal things in America is I always think science should win in the end. I mean, science is objective, it's complete. But when George Bush was elected, he called into question the science. And he said the international scientists could be wrong on this one. Let's refer to our own prestigious science body, the U.S. National Academy of Science, and ask them if this research is worth listening to. They came back very quickly and said basically yes. Then, of course, America went into Iraq the second time, and that changed the whole discussion. So, under an Obama administration, I think climate change would have some prominence. If America goes one way, it's easy to follow. If America goes a different way, it's almost impossible to defeat. And Trump has no appetite for this at all. So, I don't know. The other thing you got to understand is there's not many places, Saskatchewan is one of the few exceptions, where agriculture is actually fairly large on the plus side, if we believe the inventory numbers. Long, more than you wanted to answer, sorry.
Graham Gilchrist, Electrical Carbon Canada. The question you've raised is two things. One is I'd remind you in your presentation that there's also a $200 penalty should the farmer not create the offset. So that is one of the reasons why you had the aggregators guaranteeing the offset, is they're taking that liability away from the farmer. The question though is in your marketplace is that at some point in time through the federal legislation, you've got the ability to trade market offsets across provincial lines. So what I haven't heard you say, or the discussion on the table, is a standard protocol for, let's say, conservation crop or any, so that you're not trading Saskatchewan durum unique to it versus unique Alberta durum, on the grain market side. So you have the same offset created the same place across all of Canada. Can you address that?
Very, very good point. What we basically need is we need to go one step further. We have to have an internationally recognized offset. You've sort of posed two questions. The easier part is the last part, which is the universal acceptance. Because we all know if a market's going to work, it's going to be broad, doesn't it? It has to have a lot of players. In Canada, there were 4 provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, that signed into the California Climate Exchange, and there was some continuity there. Now, there was not a soil carbon offset protocol for the California market. The federal government has basically passed this to the province, and you guys sort this out, and if you come up with something, we'll look at it. I don't think they have the starch to dictate it. And again, what I'd say is the onus is would be on us to put forward what's a legitimate protocol. In terms of the assuming the liability, you have a very good point there. If, for example, we start losing carbon at a big rate, who's on the hook for it? Now,
in the Alberta system.
In the Alberta system, yeah.
As an example, the farmer doesn't get the full offset credit in the protocol because that has been taken out.
Yes.
In the NERC protocol, the farmer is liable for the decrease.
Yes.
So,
No, your point is correct, because there is a value to the liability. What we maintained was if you did the lease concept, which was a temporary reduction, you could address that risk. The final analysis, the emitters didn't want that. They wanted the cheap offsets. However, I would say this, if we saw a massive reversal of carbon stocks, I would bet you'd have one hell of a time finding the aggregators who would take that liability on. And my understanding is the company that did sort of half the offsets is gone.
okay, you're just left with Trimble and CCSI in Alberta.
Yes, yeah. So in essence, and that the offset, the aggregator that went away, my understanding did about half the business. Is that your understanding?
Well, we started with about 15 aggregators.
Yeah, but you ended up with 3.
Oh, 2.
2, okay. Well, now you have 2, but there were 3.
Yeah.
Okay, and the one that went, of those 3 that went away, I think did about half the business.
And they failed their audits.
Yeah.
And as a result, they couldn't eat the liability for having failed offsets.
Okay, but where I'm going is who's accepting the liability here?
Right now, the middleman, the aggregate.
And if they're gone?
the final emitters don't take it,
Yeah.
and all the contracts today have been written, the producer doesn't assume that liability.
So what actual risk do you have as an aggregator for taking on that liability if you legally fold and you're gone? Okay, so where's the integrity in that system?
That's one of the challenges and the risks of you as a producer buying that service.
Okay, no, you're kind of dodging the thing here. Who has the liability there?
At the very end of the day, the final emitter, they're the ones on the hook.
No, their contract says they don't have it.
Cut you, sorry there.
I got to step one more question, John, if you don't mind. Sure. First off, Lewis 128. I think, I'd like to acknowledge the work that you've done over the past decades. Certainly, we're fortunate in Saskatchewan when we go and lobby. A lot of the work we do with either provincially or federally, a lot of the backing we use, and we're fortunate in Saskatchewan that your group and you yourself specifically have done all this work over the decades, and we're speaking from a position of knowledge, which a lot of other jurisdictions don't have. So for that, thank you very much.
I just respond. I know this sounds a little self-effacing, but I've had some wonderful people to work with this, highly motivated and highly principled people. And the goal has always been from SSA and the people who work is that there's value here. We got to get it back to the farm gate. Hence my railing against some things.
Well, I think all the producers in this room would appreciate that and certainly agree with you. Thank you.